Before I begin, I'd like to thank the graduate program in communications here at the university. Also, Professor Eduardo Zalando, Professor Carlos Gerbes, and of course, the Pontifical Catholic University for all its kindness and consideration, and also for the opportunity to visit Porto Alegre, a beautiful place. Also, there's one other person who is really critical and who very seldom gets any acknowledgement, who works tirelessly in the background. I'm referring to the translator. So my profound thanks to all of you. I begin with something that happened a number of years ago. My father had just finished giving a speech, and at the end of it, a gentleman came up to him and said, "You know, Professor McLuhan, I find your material very difficult, very hard to understand." And my father looked at him and nodded, and he said, "Yes, so do I." I'll try to keep this fairly simple. When technology extends one of our senses, a new translation of culture occurs as swiftly as the new technology is interiorized. One of the major effects of these big technologies, like print or the internet or the alphabet, is that each one is accompanied by a renaissance. I've wondered, why are there no studies of renaissances as a phenomenon? We in the West have now endured half a dozen renaissances, so we should by now be able to enunciate at least a few general principles. Such at least will be the aim of these next few remarks. I don't know that any study has ever been made of renaissances in general. Every study that I have seen concerns one or another renaissance. Occasionally, two renaissances are examined simultaneously for purposes of contrast or comparison. Such studies are well-focused and properly scholarly. There is, besides, the veritable wealth of books about this or that Renaissance for general consumption, but there are no book-length studies, nor is there even a single article about Renaissances as a phenomenon. Our Renaissances have a number of characteristics in common. One of the most remarkable, perhaps, is the sheer numbing effect of the spectacular event. Consequently, there is never at the time any realization or acknowledgement that a Renaissance is going on. A Renaissance, you see, is always invisible to the people who are involved in it. To them, the action of renewal and revivification is so accustomed that they accept it as normal, as all of you do. The convulsion is too completely environmental to be noticeable. At such times, one notices only that matters are in advanced state of chaos. Change follows upon change, and there does not appear to be a direction or pattern to any of it. The feeble-minded chant, "Change is good," and burble slogans about progress to allay their uncertainties. Change is generally chaos in slow motion. Another characteristic is this: a Renaissance is not an isolated phenomenon. A Renaissance is actually a side effect of a precipitating action or event that occurs somewhere else. since some new technology arrives on the scene and radically reshapes perception. Similarly, an undersea earthquake can spin off a tsunami wave. In the case of the Renaissance presently underway, we have been treated to a protracted cascade of new technologies, from the AC motor to the MP3, from the telegraph or the satellite, the radio, to the internet or GPS or cloud computing. A renaissance always accompanies an earthquake in sensibility. It is the outer manifestation of interiorizing a technology. The first area of the culture to respond to the onset of a renaissance is the arts. As the poet observed, artists are the antennae of the race. One after another, all of the arts burst into renewed life and sometimes into furies of innovation. The spectacular efflorescence in the arts diverts attention from the comparatively ponderous reorganization of culture and society. Some, perhaps many of the sciences will also be affected and will make major discoveries. They will revise or replace long-held theories. Another characteristic, a renaissance is the leading edge of a new mode of culture and society. It brings with it a new kind of identity. That is, while the Renaissance is evident almost immediately because of the ferment in the arts, the accompanying new culture will be discovered sometime after it has established itself, perhaps even 2 or 3 generations later. The arts are the early warning system. Another remarkable feature of Renaissances is this. Each one is accompanied by a major war. In our present case, we have had World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, just to mention a few. And now we are embroiled in the first round of the terrorist wars. At the speed of light, the front is gone. The battleground is the entire globe now, and that much larger paysage intérieur. In War and Peace in the Global Village, my father and I showed that violence is always a response to a change in identity. We habitually refer to that magnificent Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries as the Grand Renaissance because it so far outshone the glories of all previous Renaissances. But the Renaissance that ushers us into the 21st century, this new millennium, is grander by far because this one subsumes all prior times and all prior forms of awareness. In the West, we are recycling and revisiting not only our own culture, but also we're exploring all the others, every form of experience that humans have ever created or indulged. The content, then, of the Renaissance that's surging about us now is the entire Neolithic era. The Neolithic age, which is now over, used the pastoral hunter as its content and has for over a century used pastoralism as its aesthetic. Our present environment is not made up of specialized tools. Rather, it is constituted of information and software. Now, the Orient, interestingly, is undergoing the same retrievals of Western culture as well as of its own, in the same measure and degree that we are rediscovering the East. Similarly, this is the new rise of Islam. And we have just launched another phase of this roiling renaissance on the Internet and the World Wide Web. These new forms demand participation and are by their very nature inclusive and encyclopedic. Our new media environments are now global instead of being confined to a single culture or society. They bring every culture on earth into abrasive interface with every other, an experience which fuels terrorist fury. The Grand Renaissance of the 16th century is aptly named, not only because it was the grandest and most comprehensive Renaissance in human experience, but also because it involved the entire cultural matrix of the Western world. Certainly, the Renaissance of the 12th century seemed to the participants no less grand, no less extensive, yet to us it still pales by comparison with the events of the 16th century. But we should notice that both of these cultural explosions were just that, outward movements, expansions. Our present Renaissance, powered by electricity and vastly more extensive and eclectic than any of the others, is implosive because, because it involves the entire globe at once. Once the entire globe is involved, no further expansion is possible. This condition raises the prospect that, unlike any previous time, this 20th century Renaissance will simply continue, that Renaissance will become our permanent address. All oral and tribal peoples regard present and past and future as a single multidimensional cycle or set of cycles, a vortex of cultural energies that charges them with being and cosmic significance and destiny. What goes around comes around. In the electric age, all times are simultaneously present and accessible as real, available experience. Cycles imply dynamism and compactness, a means to charge and recharge the cultural batteries. The alternative, the familiar narrative line of history, presents instead a single prolonged discharge or endless effusion. Today we live in post-history in the sense that all pasts that ever were are now present to our consciousness, and that all the futures that will be are here now. To live today is to live mythically in all cultures and times at once. The narrative of history now concludes. If there is a future to history, it resides, as the Italian rhetorician Giambattista Vico showed, it resides in the hands of poets and artists. A brief review of our acknowledged Renaissances may suggest a few further observations. So let's start with the Grand Renaissance of the 15th and 16th century. The driving technology was clearly the printing press, the Gutenberg galaxy. It ushered in a flowering and retrieval such as still holds the world in thrall, including a revival of learning, of ancient rhetoric, and of the entire manuscript culture of the ancient world in the Middle Ages. The explosion of culture extended to newfound territories around the world and ushered in a spate of empire building by Spain, Portugal, England, and others, made possible by the new technology of ocean-going ships. Rabelais, Shakespeare, Montaigne, Cervantes. Like the present one, which began in the 19th century, this Renaissance, ours, straddles 2 centuries. It began in, or rather the 16th century straddles 2. It began in the 15th and continued in the 16th. The same universal recognition holds true for the medieval Renaissance, as it's called, the Renaissance of the 12th century. The fact that it is widely deemed to be of lesser significance than that of the 16th century is a matter of comparison only, so much is it overshadowed by the Grand Renaissance. Yet, this period enjoyed a profound revival of learning due to the reappearance of paper supplies. When the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries was a renaissance of rhetoric and audience making, that of the 12th century was a renaissance of manuscript culture and the ancient tradition of literary studies, the translatio studii. Prior to these events, there was another, also sometimes called a medieval Renaissance. I refer to the Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance and the Carolingian Empire. Charles the Great, crowned Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III in Rome, in the year 800, believed that his own preoccupation with the arts and the sciences was the very duty of a ruler. Other driving technologies were the horse collar and the 8th century invented mounted shock combat, according to Lynn White, Jr. in Medieval Technology and Social Change. Antiquity imagined the centaur. The Middle Ages made him the master of Europe. The times bring to mind such personages as Bede, Alcuin, Saint Boniface. In the 8th century, England held the intellectual leadership of Europe, and it owed this leadership to the Church. From this time date the earliest written records of Old English. In the 8th century, English vernacular literature and the arts received new impetus. Workers in stone and glass were brought from the continent for the improvement of church building, and Islam was on the rise. As regards military conflict at this time, the fallout of this Renaissance included the partition of Europe and the decline of the tribal structure of that continent, the rise of the royal houses, and the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. Two earlier Renaissances form or loom as part of our survey. The first of these occurred in the 4th century AD, the other at the turn of the millennium, long about the year 0. Constantine, about 288 to 337, established Christianity as the religious foundation of Western civilization. A few familiar names will give some points of reference: St. Augustine, St. Jerome, Martianus Capella. At this time, too, the West repels assaults by Persia and the Eastern empires. The Edict of Milan in 313 gave for the first time full legal recognition to the Christian community. The Council of Nicaea in 325 was the world's first ecumenical council. This time also introduced Caesaropapism, the emperor becoming head of the Christian Commonwealth, precipitated a massive retrieval and refurbishing and renewal. May 11, in the year 330, saw the foundation of Constantinople. This city was intended from the outset to be the center of art and learning. Charlemagne built its libraries and stocked them with Greek manuscripts from an antiquity that included the great products of classical Greece. He filled the streets and squares and museums with art treasures drawn from all over the Greek Orient. 4 centuries before these events, the Emperor Caesar Augustus mounted a massive program of cultural reform. It undertook a careful retrieval of ancient Roman values and culture. Augustus revived and reestablished the office of Vates, the poet-priest of the Temple of Palatine Apollo, devoted to the spiritual side of Roman culture. It had a cultural priesthood devoted to the sacred responsibilities of poetry and the arts, and gave high salience to the works of Horace, Varro, and Virgil. This time was also a period of moral and social reform. Christianity made its appearance. Nor is this the end of the matter. Since we are surveying Western Renaissances, and the West may be said to have been defined by the phonetic alphabet, if we look beyond the 0 date, we will discover that the pattern operative in the Christian era had an earlier beginning, though the date of the first Renaissance is in some doubt. Certainly the 5th to 4th century glory of Athens would qualify. All of the other characteristics are in place. The 8th century BC presents us with Homer and Hesiod, and the early onset of phonetic literacy, which instilled a dramatically new bias of sensibility and occasioned the first major retrievals due to alphabetic writing. The Theogony was used as a pattern for retrieving and systematizing the Greek religion, and to regularize ideas of the gods and goddesses. This was also the time of the hoplite revolution, occasioned by bronze armor and the innovation of cavalry. The 8th century revolution affected not just the arts, but every walk of life. It accompanied the maturity of the Greek Iron Age. Iron had been in use from the turn of the millennium, the early Iron Age, but an enormous development of iron metallurgy between 750 and 650 BC improved and accelerated the speed and efficiency of life in many fields. And under this more stable mode of existence, the population of Greece multiplied to a remarkable extent. This increased number of inhabitants encouraged a wholesale switch from pasturage to arable farming, and food production notably intensified. I'm quoting from Michael Grant and Mr. Higg, The Greek Renaissance of the 8th Century BC, Tradition and Innovation. The events Homer recorded in Iliad and Odyssey occurred 4 centuries earlier, in about the 12th century, which was also a time of Renaissance for Troy, perhaps, certainly for Mycenae. It was called the Golden Age, the beginning of the great classical period in Greece. Now, the curious thing that emerges from our survey of Western Renaissances is the realization that they occur in a regular 4-century rhythm. Every 4th century, it seems, we have a Renaissance. That isn't to say that nothing goes on in the intervals between Renaissances. A great deal does, of course. But whatever does occupy those times doesn't qualify as a full-scale Renaissance of the sort we've been discussing. Renaissances have this one common characteristic. Each one results from an earlier action. Some spasm or cultural convulsion pulled the awareness of the culture into a new shape. In other words, what we normally notice about a Renaissance, the intensifying of artistic action and innovation, is actually a side effect of a deeper action. Then a Renaissance is the shock wave produced as that technology penetrates the culture and works its particular influence. So the pattern we found in our Renaissances shows us the effects, not the causes. 3 questions in each case then arise. What caused such a massive drift in perception as to reinvigorate the old things, and to do so in this or that particular manner? What prodded perception into that manner of noticing? Where was the stress applied? In each case, I've discovered the precipitating factor, or the deciding factor, was a new technology. In our time, it is digital media. If there is, in fact, a cycle or rhythm of Renaissances in Western culture, does this mean that there is in our culture a definite rhythm to our technologies? We already know that with the first tools, human evolution shifted from biology to technology. In all of creation, we are the only species that has thus taken charge of the course of our own evolution. Inasmuch as the technologies are actual extensions of a biological organism, us, may not that technological rhythm actually be a biological rhythm? Now, what if the Renaissance going on around us? Its underpinnings include the cascade of electric technologies over the last century and a half. Radio, telegraph, film, television, videotape, computer, and the pace is accelerating with personal computers, cell phones, global positioning satellites, space exploration, space telescopes, virtual reality, interactive multimedia, the internet, the World Wide Web, all appearing in a couple of decades. We have undergone an explosion of interest in outer space and other planets, voyages to the moon, probes sent to Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, One immediate result of satellites was our discovery, that is a rebirth, a renaissance, of Earth as a polluted planet that needed cleaning up and updating. Nature ended. The planet became an art form inside a manned space capsule, and life has never been the same. Since the present Renaissance began in the 19th century, we have seen an extensive list of innovations, more than a few of which would have been enough to launch a distinctly new form of sensibility, as events have proven. The telegraph, the photograph, movies, TVs, satellites, computers, and so on. Any of these would, under ordinary circumstances, have set a renaissance in motion. But we have had one after another without a break, and the rolling renaissance seems in response to continue to wash over our culture and civilization unabated instead of waxing and waning. Possibly then our renaissance is not one, but actually a series of overlapping renaissances, each one feeding on the energy of the previous. As the unity of the modern world becomes increasingly a technological rather than a social affair, the techniques of the arts provide the most valuable means of insight into the real direction of our own collective purposes. A word about audiences here. Print did something really remarkable. It enlarged readership and gave rise in the 17th and 18th century to a brand new phenomenon called the reading public. Electric media, from radio to digital, have produced another kind of organization, a group called the mass audience. It's well worth the time to take a moment and to spend a year or two studying the kinds of audience and the sorts of crowd that we use to organize ourselves, because these are changing rather dramatically now. Elias Canetti wrote a wonderful study called Crowds and Power, the original title in German, Maß und Macht. And in this book, he proposed that there are, in all of human experience, only two kinds of crowd. And this was certainly true up to certainly the 20th century. The two kinds of crowd he called open crowds and closed crowds. The open crowd, he said, is the natural crowd, the one that occurs most frequently. It has some characteristics. It's insatiable. It has a very pronounced need to grow, to get larger. And it also has a fear, a terror of growing smaller. As soon as the open crowd stops growing or begins to grow smaller, it dies. The closed crowd, see, the open crowd then insists on becoming as its prime characteristic. The closed crowd emphasizes being, not becoming. The closed crowd does not want to grow. It wants simply to be and to continue to be. So it convenes and disperses, and then convenes and disperses in a regular rhythm. There are furthermore admission requirements to join a closed crowd. You could call this meeting, this assembly, a closed crowd. We are in a closed room. There is an admission requirement. And as with any class, you meet, you disperse, you meet, you disperse. This is closed crowd behavior. For example, congregation in a church, closed crowd. I mentioned students and classes, closed crowd. A tribal group, a closed crowd. But in our time, we have invented a third kind, a new kind of crowd. We call it the mass audience. It is unlike either of the open or closed crowds, and it is full of paradox. On the phone, on the air, online, you are in two or more places at the same time. But you leave your body out of the equation. The physical body is no longer in charge of you. I mentioned there are a lot of paradoxes to this phenomenon. The mass audience, for one thing, it's invisible, composed as it is of de facto intelligences with no bodies. The average person every day uses interactive media from telephone to internet at a cost. He and she are transformed into bits of electric information. This disembodiment contributes to the disorientation that people feel in the material world. Minus the physical body, the user of electric media can be in 2 or 200 or 2 million places at the same time. Once on the internet, the user of electric, once on the internet, you are simultaneously everywhere the internet reaches. The enabling environment for the mass audience is the totality of electric media present and operating via broadcast or network or satellite and so on. So there is the radio crowd and the TV crowd and so on, each one a dialect, as it were, of the mass audience. The digital world is another, an all-encompassing mode of the mass audience. The mass audience cannot have distant goals or objectives. Those matters pertain to becoming, and the mass audience is concerned really with being. Being is not an objective or a goal. With no outer physical body, the mass audiences turn their attention inward. This move also appears disguised as narcissism. But it is the narcissism or the selfishness of one without a self, rather different from the selfishness that attends private individualism. Online or on the air, minus your physical bodies, you put on the corporate body. You wear all mankind as your skin. Under these conditions, a mere private sensibility would be a huge liability. The term mass audience was coined to denote broadcast media crowds. Sheer speed makes the audience, not size. So we have the paradox that all mass audiences are the same size. Physical size and number characterize incarnate crowds. At electric speed, there is no movement to or from. The user just manifests here and there, having left the body behind. There might be the other side of the world, or the other side of town, or the other side of the room. It's all the same. On the air, you can be in thousands or millions of places simultaneously. Physical laws don't apply once you leave the physical body. There is nothing on which to base them. You have become information, an environmental image, exempt from natural law. Such is our condition in the digital world. I leave you with the mystery of Renaissance cycles and with 4 questions. 1, are there in fact other iterations of the 4-century cycle in the 16th century BC, for example, or the 20th or 24th? Another, what precipitating technologies are responsible for each Renaissance? Can we now use this rhythm to date other major technological revolutions as accurately as carbon dating allows us to do, for example? Might it be possible to use this cycle as a guide to events in prehistory? In Laws of Media, the New Science, we showed that all human innovation is a form of speech, that things we make have exactly the same structure as our words and language. Technology is language without syntax. This suggests that the rhythm of renaissances in our culture reflects some fundamental rhythm of a verbal and uniquely human nature, an area I propose for further investigation. Here's another. What is the significance, the meaning of events in the intervening centuries? Is there a rhythm to those too? Do other non-Western cultures march to a different rhythm or observe a different pattern of Renaissance? Or do they have no rhythm at all? That is this 4th century cycle to our innovations and retrievals and renaissances peculiar to the West alone? Or does it actually extend to other cultures such as those in the Orient or in Central or South America or Africa maybe, or primitive Europe? Perhaps other cultures do have different rhythms. China, for example, and Egypt have followed the lines of force of the dynasty rather than those of the democracy. And their social rhythms clearly are different from ours. Their language patterns and language rhythms differ from ours too, and I would maintain that innovation and utterance are linked absolutely. Well, I've tried in the foregoing to sketch a complex matter. In the process, I've had to omit an immense amount of detail and related concerns, both cultural and anthropological. The entire matter of our renaissances and their relation to technology and perceptual change, I think, deserves prolonged study. More important, however, is the mystery of the Renaissance underway at the present. The first global Renaissance. The present is not too soon to mount studies of the present situation, if only for orienting ourselves. With some awareness of the environmental pressures acting on psyche and society alike, we might discover means to channel or control some of those energies, to reduce human misery, to preserve cultures, and to allay international uncertainties. An ecological approach to technologies and their media would seem a reasonable first step. Welcome to the Renaissance. Muito obrigado.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you. Muito bem. Agradecemos essa brilhante conferência, muito instigante, e temos algum tempo para formulações de perguntas. Eu peço aos colegas que nos auxiliam a recolher as perguntas que vocês eventualmente tenham escrito. Essa é uma boa oportunidade para a gente conversar um pouco. Então vamos tentar estimular o público a formular. Eu gostaria de aproveitar o tempo enquanto vocês escrevem para talvez provocar um pouco o ambiente e pedir ao professor Eric que responda e esclareça qual a sua posição em relação à usual acusação que se faz a McLuhan e à obra de McLuhan, de que essa visão é uma visão determinista. I'd like to ask you if you can
Yes.
clarify about, you had the translation there. Okay.
I was cheating.
Okay.
Yes, my father has often been accused of being a determinist. Thanks. And this, of course, he vigorously denied, because he said, there's no determinism, really, as long as there's a willingness to pay attention to what's going on. There's a determinism of a sort if you ignore the things that are influencing your decisions and your imagination. So you might just say, well, I don't know what's going on. But if you pay attention, then the changes are not necessarily inevitable. And if you pay attention, you can begin to take an ecological approach and program the environment for the effects you want. We've never done that, but the possibility is there. Questions?
Segunda questão, maybe can.
Oh, yes. Okay.
enquanto a gente aguarda as perguntas, é a polêmica em relação à dúvida que existe se a revolução tecnológica modifica a forma do pensamento humano. Será que os povos da oralidade pensavam de um jeito distinto da forma como nós, da era digital, pensamos? Ou seja, nós pensávamos de um jeito na era do rádio, passamos a pensar diferente na era da televisão e pensamos hoje de uma forma distinta na era digital. A tecnologia influencia o processo cognitivo humano?
Absolutely. Yes, it does. Absolutely. And the place to see this most clearly dramatized is in the arts. Our present Renaissance, as I say, started in the 19th century, but it was preceded by, let's say, Romanticism in the 19th century, the Romantic explosion in poetry, which actually began before the telegraph, but was an early response to experimentation in the 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th with static electricity. This was followed, let's say, by symbolism, by impressionism in painting, symbolist poets like Baudelaire and Rimbaud, writers like Flaubert. They initiated a completely new kind of sensibility, a new approach to understanding and language. And let's see, in all of the arts, in music, the changes were pretty dramatic, beginning with the huge operatic voices of people like Wagner. But then, notice what happened with radio. Suddenly, these huge audience or huge halls, much, much bigger than this one for the production of operas, gave way to small bands in jazz and Dixieland and so on. The change with television was even more dramatic. We went from having professional musicians like the big bands, such as Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Dorsey, Artie Shaw. The big bands of professional musicians were suddenly eclipsed and replaced by amateur musicians, which we call rock and roll. Rock and roll is a direct response to television and a totally new sensibility. Rock and roll put aside the professional and introduced the amateur. The great thing about the amateur, G.K. Chesterton once pointed out, the amateur is a man who takes the attitude, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. You see, the amateur does it for enjoyment. And the rock and roll musicians were doing their thing just for fun. They weren't really starting to entertain, and they weren't trying to take the place of some other group like the big bands. No, they were just inventing things in the garage or in the basement and playing with guitars, which is a comparatively easy instrument to learn at an amateur level. In our time, look what's going on in music, in painting. The entire city is now a canvas on which to paint.
Se é verdade, então, que a tecnologia influencia o processo, se é verdade, então, que o processo cognitivo é afetado pela tecnologia, será possível nós entendermos a oralidade primária, aquela dos povos considerados primitivos, em que predominava simplesmente a voz humana, em que as letras não tinham penetrado a mente do ser humano? Se isso é verdade, será possível nós, seres humanos, que vivem mundos tecnológicos distintos, sermos capazes de nos compreender uns aos outros, já que a diferença tecnológica não é igualmente distribuída e as civilizações humanas vivem tecnosferas completamente distintas, se a tecnologia é tão grave ao processamento cognitivo e afetivo humano, provavelmente constituía-se, então, um obstáculo à comunicação intercultural.
Yeah, this is a most interesting matter. Let me suggest right off that the first effects of a new technology are always registered in perception. And subsequent to that, we have changes in cognition and in intellectual activity. But perception is first, and that's the area the artist works in. So the artist really is a sort of antenna. And as soon as some new wavelength comes along, the artist picks up on it and begins to change how he or she presents items to us, reconfigures the arrangement of senses and of sensibilities in the art. In the 19th century, the arts switched from providing aesthetic objects to providing us instead with ways of seeing. Baudelaire opened Les Fleurs de Mal with "Hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère." Hypocrite lecteur, mask-wearing reader. And this process of wearing a mask is a very complex matter. You put on the poem as a mask, as a way of seeing, as a way of looking at and understanding your world and yourself, and the poet puts on you and your sensibilities in order to make this mask. It's a very reciprocal activity. That has been the condition of the arts since electric technology. Before then, we had some objectivity or distance or detachment between ourselves and the object, the art object. But with electricity, there's no longer any detachment. Everything is involvement and participation. And in that case, the arts have to take a new approach. With the alphabet, now we're talking about primary orality and the transition from primary orality to individualism. The effect of the alphabet was to separate knower and known. The alphabet is the most extreme form of specialism and objectivity and detachment there is. The alphabet effectively destroyed the power of the poetic establishment in Greece, and not just there, but everywhere else. I heard yesterday a mention of Eric Havelock's study, Preface to Plato, and I would strongly recommend this book as demonstrating for the first time exactly how these things occurred. The power of the poets was vested in the logos. And the logos did not allow any detachment. If you listen to a poet recite, let's say, the Iliad or the Odyssey, a recitation of the Iliad might take 2 days in a tavern. I've been told this by people whose grandfathers had heard such a thing in the hills in Greece. But if you heard the poet, remember, it wasn't spoken, it was sung. Just like to a guitar, it was sung to a lyre. And the singing has a kind of enchantment about it. It may have sounded a bit like Gregorian chant. The singing is so compelling. It draws you in so completely that you have no separation between you and the people and the events. If you hear of Achilles getting into an argument or a fight and conquering a foe, you become Achilles. You have these experiences exactly as if you were the person, as if you were there, because you are there, engaged in this. And as a result, these events and the words become absolutely memorable. My friend Philippe Dean, whose grandfather told him of this experience, said that For the rest of his life, his grandfather could recite verbatim long passages of Homer. He could never read. He'd never learned to read, so he was able to do this. But writing with the alphabet, breaks this bond and separates knower and known. And thereby it creates objectivity and intellectual detachment and all of the things that we regard as necessary for private identity and for individualism. Those things come out of the alphabet, as does abstract science. May I recite an anecdote about Aristotle? Okay. I see we have a lot of questions here, and I don't want to take too much time.
Aproveito que era a minha última pergunta, que eu estou dando tempo para as pessoas
We'll see.
formularem as perguntas. Considerando, então, esta visão, de uma certa maneira, nós somos fruto do ambiente tecnológico que a gente vive, é se imaginar que nós ganhamos e perdemos, à medida que surge uma revolução tecnológica. Eu gostaria de perguntar para o Sr. McLuhan, o que nós perdemos com a atual revolução tecnológica? E o que nós ganhamos? Eu observo, por exemplo, tentando eu mesmo responder a minha pergunta, talvez de uma forma indigesta, uma coisa curiosa no Brasil. A oralidade é um fenômeno, por vezes, escasso entre nós. E eu observo que na minha geração nós nos encontrávamos, caçávamos, namorávamos nos clubes. Eu não vou dizer mais do que a gente fazia no clube, mas eu deixo para a imaginação de vocês. E a atual geração encontrou um lugar esquisito, aos meus olhos, para fazer o mesmo, que são os postos de gasolina. Eu não entendo bem a razão pela qual os jovens buscaram nos postos de gasolina esse fascínio pelo encontro e pela oralidade. A minha hipótese é que lá se vende álcool. E o álcool é lubrificante social. Há pessoas que só conseguem gargalhar, caçar e beliscar depois de umas 2 ou 3 cervejas. Então, a minha hipótese para a resposta que eu mesmo fiz foi o fato de que nos postos de gasolina se vende álcool. Mas vamos fazer um pouco de brincadeira, uma pergunta séria, que é esta. No cálculo, o que nós ganhamos e o que nós perdemos com a atual revolução tecnológica dos meios de comunicação?
I think everybody is aware that the idea of privacy is undergoing some radical changes right now. But privacy goes with private identity. Cultures without private identity have no use for privacy, and they really don't understand what we mean by the idea or by the word. Privacy involves having as a ground a community of other people. Privacy is not simply a matter of being alone. That's solitude. A castaway on a desert island doesn't have privacy. He has solitude. Now, our habits of privacy are changing even as the surveillance, electronic surveillance, increases. It has been this way until now. And there were 2 major forms of privacy. In North America, Canada, and the U.S., we had one form, and as far as I know, all the rest of the world used a different form. The North American goes outside to be private. He goes out to a restaurant, he goes out to a movie, and this is why we have drive-in culture in North America, drive-in movies and drive-in laundromats, and even drive-in funeral parlors, all sorts of crazy stuff. But if you want privacy in North America, the great bastion of privacy for kids has always been the motor car and the drive-in movie. No other culture has drive-in movies. They never caught on in Europe. And I understand there was for a while an experimentation with them in Australia, but that didn't persist. However, right now drive-in movies are very hard to find in North America. The reason people went outside for privacy was that there was no privacy in the home. The North American home was a place of entertainment. That's where you went for social life. So if you were outside and you met somebody who was interesting and you wanted to continue the conversation, you said, come on home, I'll introduce you to the wife and the kids, we'll have dinner, and we can talk about this matter further. I've known a few Europeans for most of my life, and I have never once been invited to their houses. They have social life outside and privacy at home, exactly the reverse of our pattern in the States. Well, I suggest it's changing in our country. I think it will probably be changing everywhere else too. I think here's what's coming. We will relinquish the idea of privacy, even as we are now relinquishing our hold on private identity. In the youth, I see now a great attraction to joining groups, to becoming part of a group, a corporate identity. The adults haven't quite gone this far. They're still somewhat civilized. And I'm using the word civilized in a technical sense, from the civis, the private citizen, the private person. By a sort of irony, in Greece, the same person, the person with private thoughts, ideas, ambitions, was called an idiot. If I could wish you a happy future, I would wish that you all become idiots. However, let's get back to the changes. The electric world provides no means of detachment. Instead, it emphasizes participation and involvement at every level of society, every level of intellectual and social life. And without detachment and objectivity, you cannot have privacy. And you can't have individualism. I think that here is the future, I think. Jacques.
Thank you. Nós temos 10 perguntas. Minha sugestão ao professor McLuhan, então, que eu as formule e que a resposta seja objetiva.
I'm not getting this.
My suggestion, I'll ask you 10 questions.
Oh, okay.
And you will give short answers for each one of them.
Yes or no?
No such. Because we have 10 questions, and
okay.
It's impossible to make long speeches on all of them.
Fair enough.
Está traduzindo? Maybe you can.
It's working again?
Esse é o problema da comunicação intercultural.
No. Try it again. No.
Alô, está traduzindo? Alô? Não está?
No, it doesn't work.
How do we see the revolution in the Arab states and the access to media in that part of the country? There is a connection between this renaissance on communication and the public revolution in the Arab states.
In the Arab states, well, I mentioned that this renaissance is a global one, a global renaissance that affects every culture. So, good, thank you. The Arab Spring is a renaissance, very clearly. And renaissances, remember, are always accompanied by war. And our 20th century renaissance is very far from over. And the wars continue. The upside, however, is that with these new electric technologies, it makes it possible for everyone to participate in the artistic process. Art is no longer a specialist activity.
Okay. Eu creio que a pergunta do Bruno se refere ao mesmo assunto. Qual é a sua opinião sobre as relações políticas, classe popular? Eu creio que essa temática foi abordada nessa pergunta. A não ser que o Bruno esteja insatisfeito com essa junção, ele pode se pronunciar. A segunda pergunta. Que lugar ocupam as leis da mídia no pensamento de McLuhan? Seria uma espécie de síntese? Não sei bem o que quer dizer com leis de mídia, mas a pergunta é essa. Que lugar ocupam as leis da mídia no pensamento de McLuhan? Seria uma espécie de síntese?
Yes, it is.
A bit more.
The book began as a preparation for a 10th anniversary edition of Understanding Media. So it didn't begin as a synthesis at all, just a few more chapters on things like cable TV and satellite. Sputnik had just gone up, and that sort of thing. And we took it to the publisher, and they said, but this is new. We don't want new. We want a couple more chapters so we can sell some more books. So we went back to work, and yes, it is a synthesis, and deliberately so. A synthesis and a march into entirely new territory.
Eu gostaria de saber a sua opinião sobre os meios impressos na era digital. Eu acho que a Beatriz pergunta isso porque fica implícita o olhar pessimista em relação ao futuro da mídia impressa.
Okay? Right. The age of print is over. That is, print is no longer in charge of our culture. There's no question about that. However, this isn't necessarily bad news. One of the first effects of obsolescence is a sudden proliferation. And another is that the old thing now becomes an art form, an aesthetic activity in its own right. And this is very clearly also happening with print right now.
Podemos entender na renascença atual uma passagem de uma era da narrativa para uma da experiência, comandada pela ideia de interatividade? Pergunta da Ana.
I would agree with that idea completely. The passage into the new age is one in which, as I suggested, every man becomes artist. Every man begins to have that kind of freshness of sensibility available. So it is a renewal of the sort of sensibilities that we had as children. Einstein once said, there are children playing in the street who have better perceptions than I do, who could solve my problems like that. If only I had that kind of fresh, untainted awareness. So I think it's an age of great optimism.
Eu gostaria de aproveitar essa pergunta para solicitar ao professor McLuhan diferenciasse dois conceitos, o conceito de interatividade e o conceito de participação. Muitas vezes a mídia formula a ideia de que tem interatividade com o seu público, quando na verdade existe uma participação do público, mas não uma interatividade. O atual contexto tecnológico facilita a participação ou a interatividade?
The real stage on which the drama is played out isn't that of the content of the media. It is really that of the media themselves as extensions of our sensibilities. When you extend one sense into the environment, it has a reciprocal effect on all of the other senses.
Isso é o problema da revolução tecnológica.
This is most amusing.
Yeah.
I've lost my place.
The question was regarding
interactivity. Yes.
participation.
Let me put it this way. involvement and participation in media, you have no choice except to participate in the media, all media. For example, you go into a movie. This is going to be a little longer answer.
No problem.
You go to a movie, and on the screen, you see either a complete picture or nothing. You go from having a photograph to a blank, to a photograph to a blank, to a photograph to a blank. The photographs are all static. You provide the motion. Your job in the movie, on the screen, is to provide all the movement. You cannot refuse. You cannot say, well, I'm not going to participate this time. I'm going to be objective. I'll just observe. I won't fill in the movement. You can't do it. I've tried. It's impossible. For a while in the early days of film, when it ran at 16 frames a second, you could see it flicker. And so you could almost imagine seeing a series of still photographs without providing the motion that connects them. But when it went up to 24 frames for sound, it suddenly became impossible. When you put the same movie on television or a computer screen, there's no flicker. It doesn't take pictures. It provides you with a continuous process of changing and transforming and metamorphosing, so that at any given moment on the television screen, what you have is a few dots, and you are engaged at every moment then in providing the rest of the image. You have no choice. So your participation, involvement in the medium is complete in every case. It's true of radio, it's true of everything, of the internet. This is different from interactivity, as you point out. Interactivity occurs on the conscious level, but the involvement occurs up at the unconscious level. Interactivity, you can choose to participate or not. But as long as the set is on, you're participating.
Very nice. Ok. O senhor fez uma relação entre rock e a televisão. A pergunta é qual aquela reação artística que ocorreria hoje em dia ao universo da internet. Se o rock está para a televisão, o que estaria para a internet?
It hasn't quite arrived, but I think it will be something along the line of the music of the spheres, the ancient idea of cosmic harmony.
Esse é um momento místico.
You wanted a short answer?
I did my joke. This is a mystic moment.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Then our future is mysticism.
Yes.
A bit more.
When you live in many times at the same time, you are living mythically. The myth occurs on more than one level and in more than one time. It doesn't go out of date. On the internet, for example, you are present simultaneously in all the parts of the world. In some of them it is today, in some of them it is yesterday. You are also present and an element of every culture in the world. And some of these cultures are very primitive, and some of them are very advanced, and everything in between. All of these experiences are part of your experience, and it is so common that you don't even notice it. This is mythic living, and it's not the future, it's now.
O senhor referiu em uma das conferências que aquilo que é realmente potente é invisível. Mas esse tipo de encontro que a gente faz aqui é para tornar visível tudo que é invisível. O que o senhor apontaria como poderosamente invisível na nossa conjuntura e que seja possível torná-la visível nesse encontro?
Powerfully invisible. Well, that's actually a very easy answer. It's the environment that is invisible. And you need to have tools to make the environment visible. This was the problem faced a century ago by phenomenology. Phenomenology was an attempt to wipe out the figures that occupied attention and to make the surrounding ground, which was invisible, make it manifest itself. And to a large extent, phenomenology failed in that regard. But we have the artists who satirize the environment, who satirize us, and who make these things begin to enter our conscious awareness. It's only then that we can take charge of them. So, and this is why I mentioned media ecology. Media ecology has to retrieve the arts and the humanities as necessary for the survival of science.
You have now 3 questions in English. Then I'll pass to you. You can read the questions.
Oh, dear. And I need technology.
Essas são as 3 últimas perguntas. Se alguém tiver alguma mais, é hora de remeter. Caso contrário, nós responderemos essas 3 perguntas e encerraríamos nosso encontro. Professor.
Access, knowledge.
Às vezes não fica claro.
We will live together as one unique soul. This is a very complex one. Please excuse me for taking a moment. It asks if everybody is connected, receiving and producing, and sharing access, all the knowledge, we will live together as one unique soul. Another paradox of the mass audience is that while the mass is a single thing, the souls, the intellects involved are, of course, different and unique. The condition is odd because the only experience or the only knowledge we have of beings with intellect and without bodies is angels. I'm not for a moment suggesting that we become angels. I've been studying Thomas Aquinas lately, and he pointed out a most remarkable idea that every angel is a distinct species. There is no species called angels. There is a species called humans. But if we move outside the body, possibly we will inhabit this intermediate stage of having individual ideas, individual consciousness, and yet becoming each of us an individual species. We will live together as one unique soul? No, I don't think so. We will live together as unique species, each of them with a soul. I don't know how else to approach this, and I know that's not very satisfactory, but these things are difficult. As my father said, yes, they are. Another one. How does McLuhan recognize the relationship of object and subject into other level of comprehension? Distinctions between subjects and objects actually don't make a lot of sense, in the world of the disembodied, which is our normal condition now. That's one reason that these questions arise. They've been settled for 2,000 years. But we have changed so dramatically in the last century that we have to ask all of these questions about subjectivity and so on all over again, and the answers are now very new, very different. There's nothing in our Western tradition to enable us to deal with these things, which may be a good reason for bringing into focus some of the Oriental philosophies and Oriental modes of understanding and adding them to ours. You can do that with knowledge. You cannot do it with media. Media cannot, they're not additive. When you bring a new medium into place, it isn't simply added to the current situation. It is itself a new situation that encompasses all the old ones. The first example of this was the failure of educational TV 50 years ago. TV came along and while everybody was a little worried about it, they thought, here's a new intellectual resource, let's put TV in the classroom. Wrong. You don't put TV, which is huge, inside the classroom, which is small. TV goes around the classroom and changes it. Right now we have the same thing going on with the laptop computers. You don't put the laptop inside the classroom. The laptop has already swallowed the classroom and changed it totally and completely. How can we, the next question, how can we link the concept of post-human with McLuhan's studies? Well, I think you could say that McLuhan pointed this out perhaps before anyone else. He was talking about this in the 50s and the 60s. Post-human just means that what we used to call human, the physical, mechanical aspect of ourselves, has been set aside as no longer being in charge of our experience. There's a poster or a drawing in the lobby outside this hall showing a museum exhibit of the human body using real human bodies. It makes you think of the medical experiments conducted in the time of Leonardo, for example, where they needed to know what made the human body work and what was going on under the skin, so they had to take it off and look. The human body now is, notice, it's an art object. It's subject to programs like any machine. You can get drugs that take you up or bring you down, drugs that fix you or that break you. Your body is now made of replaceable parts. It can be reshaped, recontoured into almost any condition you want. And I don't mean just Botox and cosmetic surgery. The human body is now an art form. And that is only possible after it's obsolete. Similarly, the book is now an art form. And completely new kinds of literacy are suddenly making their appearance on the stage. We have television literacy and film literacy and art literacy and so on and so on. So the idea of literacy, instead of being confined just to letters, has become a process that involves nearly everything in our experience. One last one.
One more, the last one. Maybe.
Yeah.
Walter Benjamin dizia que a alma da arte poderia se perder com sua infinita reprodução. O senhor acha que a alma da arte pode se perder na internet, onde ela pode ser reproduzida infinitas vezes?
Mm-hmm. And yet every reproduction now is unique. Because every reproduction includes the experience of the beholder. And that interaction is unique in every single case. The idea of reproduction comes from the mechanical age, from the industrial age. And that industrial age is, well, it's well past us. So, of course, now it's easily accessible and quite visible. We tend to interpret the present in terms of the recently discovered past. And I come again back to the artist. The artist is the only person in the society who has the tools to look at and study the present. That makes him a threat to everybody else who is unable to do that, and they think he's crazy. If they think you're crazy, it's a good sign.
Para terminar, então, eu gostaria de perguntar o seguinte. O Martin McLuhan, num certo momento, foi muito criticado por não ser um autor empírico, por ele seguir, de uma certa maneira, a tradição especulativa, uma certa maneira, um certo filósofo, uma certa filosofia da tecnologia. Tem sido apontado como uma espécie de visionário, um profeta. O senhor considera o seu pai um visionário, um profeta, ou um cientista, no sentido clássico do termo?
We called our last book together Laws of Media and subtitled it The New Science. That was a sort of ironic subtitle because we were contrasting our science with that of Aristotle. Aristotle's organon was the old science, at least in our view. And we had behind us Francis Bacon and Giambattista Vico all playing the same game. The new science, paradoxically, is older than Aristotle. And that was a bit of fun. However, McLuhan, my father, and I call him McLuhan too, my father was an empiricist. He didn't work with scientific theory. He worked with observation. And what's wrong with being a prophet? Prophets only are prophets because they see things that other people haven't yet discovered. My father used the techniques of the arts. He was intensely trained in the arts and in criticism, and he brought these tools to bear on everyday life. And so he saw things that nobody would see for 20 or 30 years. If you look at the advertising techniques in use today, you will find that they were being experimented with 30 years ago in modern art. The artists are generally 30 years ahead of the crowd, a generation.
Muito obrigado, foi um prazer enorme ter o professor Eric McLuhan entre nós. Peço ao público ter uma salva de palmas.
Thank you, Jack.
Gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos, lembrar então, teremos um encontro com o neto de McLuhan às 5h30, à tarde teremos ainda os GTs, e à noite, para encerrar o nosso encontro com alegria, um pouco de pagode, samba e as gritarias do professor Gerbasi. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Jacques.